Welcome. My name is Patrick Curran, and along with my as permanent as a Sharpie friend Greg Hancock, we make up Quantitude. We are a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In this week's episode, Greg and I follow up our previous discussion of time-varying covariates with a conversation about methods for modeling the simultaneous development in two or more constructs over time. Along the way, we also discuss back tattoos, right lane closures, 49.5-pound luggage, Clear, the United Lounge, Sharpies, Neo, the Urfdedurfdedingerdonger, Living with Mommy or Daddy, Hairballs of Science, Selfish Bastards, Lick'em Señor, Phantom Variable Road Trip, The Trouble with Tribbles, Achieving Our Ideal Rank, and Apologies to the Dutch. We hope you enjoy this week's episode. Now, for a guy who has all but tattooed on his lower back, early is on time and on time is late, what does late count as?
Late is left behind, damn it. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I'm running a little bit late. I'll tell you why I'm running late. I had to drop Gus off at doggy daycare this morning, and on the way back, there was a right lane that was closed. And so what do I do as soon as I see the sign that the right lane's closed? I get over into the left-hand lane because that's what you're supposed to do. But no, all the other get in the right-hand lane, go as far as they can up front, and then they cut in, and they get in way ahead of me. It is not fair, and that's why I'm late.
Do you feel better now?
A little bit.
You know what I like is that you became uncorked over the lane, but you took no exception to the back tattoo.
I'd have to get the other one removed first.
But this is actually a perfect start because we left off the last episode with we were going to open with things that were unfair.
Oh, yeah.
And that was not even planned.
It's so organic.
But we left off with these things that are unfair. What I love is why everything is a little bit rushed today is as soon as we're done here, you're flying out to LA in, like an hour? We should probably get to work because you got to get to BWI.
I do. And you know what? I weighed my suitcase and it's 49.5 pounds because I have to be under 50 pounds. And you know what's going to happen? I'm going to go to the airport. Somebody's going to throw their suitcase up there at 54, 55 pounds and they're just going to shrug and go, yeah, okay, whatever. That is not fair.
What are you bringing? Like I pack in a Ziploc. What are you bringing to LA that weighs 49.5 pounds?
I just never know which shoes go best with the outfit.
But the airport literally represents all of inequity that we face in society. All right, so everybody, picture driving into the airport. What's the first thing you see? Premier parking is to the right. Economy parking is to the left. So you go into economy parking. You need to check your 49.5-pound bag that's full of human heads or whatever it is you travel with. There's an opening for gold members, and then there are 800 people in the regular line. So you check your bag, then you go up the escalator, and you go through security, and there's pre and there's regular. Now, pre is good, except Clear is right next to it, that have 18 people working there and nobody going through Clear.
It's a cult.
So you get through that. You want to get a Starbucks. You get in line with 20 people, and person after person walks by you to pick it up because they ordered on their phone when they were in the Premier parking lot. So then you get out, and all the seats are taken in the terminal, but you see people going into the United Airlines lounge, right? Those smoky glass doors that open and close.
What goes on in there?
And it drives me nuts because my brother travels for work, and he gets to go in there, and I don't. Then they queue up to get on board, and you're in group one. All right, you're still the last person to get on board because they've got the gold, and they've got the platinum, and they've got families, and everybody goes on. You know what my one lifeline was in this sea of inequity? I always fly Southwest, and the thing that I genuinely loved was when you turn the corner onto the 737, any seat, any person, it doesn't matter how much you make, it doesn't matter how many human heads you're traveling with in your 49-pound bag, any seat is open, and they even took that away from me.
In the new year, there will be no more open boarding on Southwest, and flyers can pay for upgrades.
This is an unexpected amount of therapy this morning.
I feel better, too.
I'm so glad.
This episode may be useless to people, but I think you and I have kind of... that's been cathartic.
I didn't get enough out, but it's okay. It's okay.
The episode is young.
It's true. I'm still teed up for some other stuff. But yeah, we did end last time with It's Not Fair.
It's not fair.
And we had gone through the idea of having time-varying covariates where we have some growth process that's occurring over time. And rather than having a time-invariant covariate, which is just that variable that launches the trajectory off on its own, we talked about time-varying covariates, which are those variables that might provide the pokes and prods along the way at the different time points. But where It's Not Fair came in is that we were really just relegating those time-varying covariates to be in service of this other variable and whatever process it had. But time-varying covariates can have some interesting things going on themselves.
That's exactly right. The unfair thing was, let's just call our primary outcome variable Y, whatever that might be. Let's say it's alcohol use. And let's call our time-varying covariate Z, whatever that might be. And maybe we call that anxiety. We build this beautiful growth model for Y in whatever form that might be. Maybe it's linear or curvilinear or piecewise or freed loading. We can do a whole lot of things with that. But the poor Z's, they're just given a mean, a variance, and a covariance and sent to stand in the corner. But what if there is growth in the Z's that we are not representing in the model? That's inequity number one.
Oh, it isn't fair.
The second inequity with the TVCs is Z gets to predict Y. So you can say, how does your earlier anxiety relate to your later alcohol use? But Y doesn't predict Z. There is no reciprocal effect. What if they actually have a predictive relation back to the TVC? And the response that any parent has had is,
life's not fair, is it?
There were two things that you alluded to in the last episode that I want to just lead off with right here. One is, historically, when someone has said, oh, I'm studying change in whatever, I'm studying change in Y, we all kind of just nodded and go, oh, yeah, okay. But more and more, I think we need to ask people, what exactly do you mean by change in Y, right? We can't just give people a pass on that because there's often this gap between what people think they're studying and what they're actually modeling. And that ties to the second thing that you've said. And of all the things that you have ever said, this is one of my favorites. Wait, what was it? It's the notion of the whiteboard. I love the whiteboard. Can you reintroduce the idea of the whiteboard?
not really, because it kind of is just what you said. It's a whiteboard.
Oh my God, this is going to be so good. Go ahead, Patrick.
You and I managed to actually write an entire paper around the whiteboard.
Yeah.
All it is stand in front of a whiteboard and take a permanent Sharpie. So did you hear Trump's thing where he went on a 5-minute conversation in a cabinet meeting about Sharpies and how they're the best pens and how Sharpie reached out to him to make a special presidential pen?
So this pen is very inexpensive, but it writes well. I like it. I don't want to give too much publicity, but they do treat me well, Sharpie.
And later, Sharpie Company said they've never spoken to Trump, they've never had these conversations, and they have no idea what he's talking about.
The company that makes Sharpies told the Washington Post the conversation the president said he had with the head of Sharpie never happened.
So we're going to take a special Quantitude Sharpie pen that the Sharpie Company made specially for us and go up to the board and put rectangles in that represent whatever your measured variables are. This is what we have in our data file. This is what is in that rectangular data matrix. If you have 5 measures of depression, you put a rectangle for each one. Dep 1, Dep 2, Dep 3 through 5. You got 5 of anxiety, Sharpie them in. If you've got time invariant covariates, a treatment condition, whatever your measured variables are, permanently put them up on the board in these rectangles. Then toss the Sharpie on the table, and pick up a dry erase marker. Because what we're going to want to do is put some things in and take some things out. There are maybe a dozen different models that go by half a dozen different names that are nothing more than how you take that dry erase marker and connect your measured variables. They are nothing more than alternative ways that you put in double-headed arrows, single-headed arrows, circles. And when you start thinking about it in that way, it's almost like Neo in seeing the Matrix at the end of the first movie.
He is the one.
Oh, this model seems really different from this model, seems really different from this model, but all we're doing is making a different statement about the underlying process that we believe gave rise to our observed data.
I think this is such a powerful idea, not even just in the context of longitudinal models like we're talking about right now, but I mean just models in general. What you have done is sharpied in the stuff that we can see, the evidence, the observations that we have, and everything else is coming out of our mind, right? Every arrow that we draw is us saying, I think this is what's going on. Every circle that we might put in, I think this is a construct that's operating in the background. We could have 10 people go up to that board, pick up the dry erase marker, and put 10 different sets of connections representing 10 different theories. We don't know. We don't see the process. The only thing we see are the boxes. So I love this idea just as a metaphor for there are things that we see and there are things that we don't see. And in this longitudinal world that we're talking about, there are still so many different ways that people can connect these variables.
We can even go back to the traditional autoregressive cross-lagged model, and that's just one way of connecting the boxes. Picture those 5 rectangles on alcohol use and 5 rectangles on anxiety. Now just picture we're going to have ALK 1 and draw a single-headed arrow to point to ALK 2. ALK 2 to ALK 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. Then we have anxiety 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. And then we have the lags. Anxiety 1 predicts ALK 2 and ALK 1 predicts anxiety 2. All right, put those in with your dry erase marker. That is the autoregressive cross-lag model. All right, and there are all sorts of limitations to that in a lot of settings. Not all settings, but a lot of settings. And so your eye twitches a little bit and you say, I don't like connecting them that way. I got an idea. I'm going to erase those. Now, notice the rectangles stay there because they're Sharpied in.
That's right.
With the special custom Quantitude Sharpie pen that we got directly from the president of Sharpie Company.
They're much better pens.
Those stay, but now you throw in a couple of circles and point to alcohol use, and then you take anxiety and point directly to the alcohol use items. That's the TVC model that we talked about last week. You have a growth process for alcohol use, and you're looking at the time-specific influences of anxiety. It's exactly the same data and measures. You're just making a different statement. Yep. And now what we're saying at the start of this continued conversation is, what if we don't want that structure? A good parent shrugs and says, well, what are you going to do about it? And you could look at it and say, well, I could erase the TVC effects and I could draw a couple of circles that represent the growth process for anxiety as well. So alcohol use gets a couple of circles. You shrug and you draw a couple of circles under what was the TVC but is now a second outcome. Nothing has changed with the rectangles,
That's right.
But now you have a multivariate latent curve model.
So if we're just talking linear for simplicity, I have maybe an intercept and slope factor for alcohol use, an intercept and slope factor for anxiety, and those factors covary, and that's interesting. First of all, it's not making alcohol use or anxiety more important than the other. It's allowing them to co-develop. And the relations across those constructs are kind of interesting. Now, again, I'm so enamored of this point that I'm going to keep saying it, and then Patrick will edit it out. But we still only have the rectangles on the board. Everything else that we've drawn is just our belief about what might be operating. One of the lovely things about the modeling that we do, though, is that the different models that we have imply different ways that our variables should be behaving. The autoregressive cross-lag panel model implies a certain pattern of variances, covariances, and maybe means among the variables. models. The model that we just had, the multivariate growth model, where we have growth in alcohol use and growth in anxiety, allowing those to covary. That model implies a particular pattern of variances, covariances, and means. We don't have different data for those two things, but the implications of those models are different.
We've established early on that I actually don't know a lot about statistics, and I just use like analogies for everything. What Greg is talking about is a sausage maker. And what is that? Well, it's a thing called a matrix-valued function. So the classic one in factor analysis is lambda psi, lambda prime plus theta epsilon. All right, that represents a factor analysis. That actually comes directly into play in the growth models that we're talking about now, because the growth model itself actually is a factor model. So if we have this multivariate latent curve model, literally the model implied covariance matrix, right? So we have the covariance matrix we observed, and we have the covariance matrix that the model believes to exist. Well, that is in lambda psi lambda prime plus theta eps.
Completely.
So what we do is we have this lovely little thing. It's a vector and it's lowercase theta. And what it is the IKEA storage system, right? It's the Urfdedurfdedingerdonger.
Hi, this is Tove Larsen, linguistics faculty at Northern Arizona University and Quantitude Swedish language consultant. And that's definitely not what that means.
And it's a vector, and it has as many cubby holes in it as there are parameters for the covariance structure. And you run that vector through the sausage maker, which is lambda psi lambda prime plus theta, and it pops out the model implied covariance matrix. So the autoregressive cross-lag has one sausage maker, the same rectangles, but a different Urfdedurfdedingerdonger.
Nope, that's not even the same wrong thing you said before.
And then you have the TVC and you have the multivariate, and each of these gives a different model implied covariance matrix. Now, it's a little tricky because some of those are nested where you could do a likelihood ratio test, but quite honestly, not many of them are because you're changing too many knobs at once. So we start to squint and cock our head and say, I don't know. I like that one.
Ake.
Wait, how do you get Liam Neeson to say that?
Akaike.
But I would say as far as co-development goes, allowing each of those factors to have their own growth process maybe is a little bit more fair, but it still might not correspond to our actual question about what's going on or our theory about what's going on from the perspective of change.
Oh, dude, you're spot on. Because every time you erase part of that diagram and draw in a new one, you're not just changing the sausage maker and what the implied covariance and mean structure is. You are making a fundamentally different statement about the hypothesized theoretical model of change. So when people start saying, oh, estimate all these models and pick the one that best represents the data, absolutely not, because you're making fundamentally different statements about the underlying causal process that you believe gave rise to your observed data.
So in the multivariate latent growth curve model, we would have to have some belief that there is a growth process operating in both of those, and those growth processes are related. And the relations that we're talking about are really at a between level. That I have a certain amount of growth in my alcohol use. I have a certain amount of growth in my anxiety. You have a certain amount of growth or change in each of those. Everybody has a certain amount of growth or change in each of those things. And then when we see a positive association, let's say, between the growth on those things, what we really mean is that people who tend to be higher relative to others on their growth, on anxiety, are also the people who tend to be higher on their growth or change in the alcohol use relative to other people. So this is a model of change, and that change is something that's occurring within individuals, but the relations that we're talking about are really at that between level, and we have to have research questions that are targeted to those levels.
And this brings us to our next advanced topic in mathematical statistics, which is, do you want to live with mommy or do you want to live with daddy?
Too soon. Too soon.
And what I mean is, Greg beautifully described this notion that the individual variability in these trajectories and how they relate to one another is fundamentally a between-person characteristic. But beyond that, it also is not linked to time. Mm-hmm. So we talked about that in the prior episode, is John Stuart Mill is spinning in his grave because I have an intercept and a slope and you have an intercept and a slope, but they are not sub-t, right? They are not linked in time.
Yeah.
So now picture two versions that we've drawn on the whiteboard. We have the time-varying covariate model, where we have a growth process for y, and we use z as a time-linked predictor of y. So we can have z at time 1 predicting y at time 2, and so on. And we talked a lot about this in the prior episode. But the kids said, that's not fair. I want a growth process for anxiety.
No fair.
And so we say, okay, we're going to erase that and we're going to build you this growth model for anxiety. Are you happy? Now there's individual variability in growth in alcohol use. There's individual variability in growth in anxiety. There, are you happy? And the kid says, but where did time go? I don't have a link to sub-t. There's no temporal precedence. It's all back to these between-person characteristics. So we are forced to choose, and it really is a forced choice. Mm-hmm. Do you want to build a time lag in with the TVC, or do you want to lose that and build a growth process for the TVC? But at least in traditional settings, you can't have both.
At least in traditional settings, he says. So are there models then that can serve as hybrids between the growth structure that we're talking about and some of the causal elements? Are there ways to try and pull that T back in?
Yes, there are. And we have been trying to figure this out, and I mean we writ large. My fingerprints are on some of this, but a lot of really good people have done a lot of really good work in this, and I've hacked up a couple of hairballs that have tried to address this, but it was just in a giant pile of hairballs. The Hairballs of Science. I now see a new book. Someone out there can write it.
That's your Festschrift.
Here's the thing, and this is kind of where I started thinking about all of this as a whiteboard problem. This goes back years and years ago, but quite honestly, I was a selfish bastard because I was working with real data on a real question. We were looking at some of the stuff we're talking about, depression, anxiety, and delinquency in adolescence. I fit an autoregressive cross-lag model, old school. Mm-hmm. I fit a TVC growth model, and I fit a multivariate growth model. I had all three of these as different options for representing the data, and none of them were completely satisfactory to me. Mm-hmm. I literally, now this isn't even figuratively, I literally was working at a whiteboard, and I thought, well, what happens if we took these growth processes in a multivariate LCM and we leave them as they are, but we just chalk in bidirectional relations at the level of the variables of the time repeated assessment. So we have a multivariate growth model. Alcohol use gets a growth process. Anxiety gets a growth process. But I just walked up and drew in ALK 1 predicts anxiety 2. Anxiety 1 predicts ALK 2, and I marched it down the set of measured variables. I just drew it in, and I thought, I wonder if that's identified. And so I kind of dinked around with it a little bit, and it was like...
That's a lot of arrows.
Well, that's a lot of arrows, although most of them are fixed, right?
That's
because
true.
They're the factor loadings. They're not estimated.
Yeah.
These models look much more complicated than they actually are because of how many things we're fixing and restricting in them. Mm-hmm. So I dinked around a little bit, and I kind of convinced myself that it was identified. And then whenever I start getting confused, I try to subcon the workout to somebody who's smarter than I am. And I went next door and sat in Ken Boland's office, and I sketched some of these things out. And that became the autoregressive latent trajectory model, or the ALT model.
In theory, it's the best of both worlds. You've got the growth model, you've got the variables hooked up to each other in an autoregressive way, everything you could possibly want all in one place.
The model is absolutely and unambiguously correct, and you can't see me using air quotes here, but Greg can. Well, actually not, because he's watching cat videos whenever I'm talking. But it is correct because all it does is put a few more elements in the Inker-Dinker Frinkdingdorker IKEA storage system.
Just no.
And it runs it through sigma of theta and mu of theta, and it gives us a new covariance matrix and a main vector. And so from that sense, it's just an alternative representation on the whiteboard. But we wrote some papers on this. Ken did some really nice work on it as well that I was not involved with. He was working with some other colleagues. And so there are lots of ways that we can work with this model. But I started to not feel completely comfortable with how it related to the underlying theory of change over time. And I've written about this, and I'll put up a few papers in the show notes that describe it, so I won't go into the bloody details here. But anybody who's up on their path tracing rules, it should make you squint a little bit when you think about what I described, because I was super clear in saying that I put these regression parameters in at the level of the measured variable. What that's going to allow is the mean structure and the covariance structure of one construct to leak across to the other construct. That is, it's exactly like the time-varying covariate model in that now that growth process of anxiety is in part being impacted by those lagged effects from depression, and the lagged effects from anxiety to depression are affecting the growth process that underlies alcohol use. All right, and so what that means is picture the growth in depression and anxiety without those autoregressive effects. You get a mean, you get a variance, you get a covariance. When you put those autoregressive effects in, those means and variances and covariances actually change. And indeed, it can even change the shape of the trajectory. There was somebody a number of years ago who went after us about this thing and wrote a fairly critical paper. It was very well done, but it was pointing out that you could have a curvilinear trajectory in one of the constructs, and the autoregressive among the observed repeated measures would account for that, and it would look linear when it was actually curvilinear. Ken and I were aware of this, right? I mean, that's part of the model. When you do the matrix algebra, it's sitting right there. But I started to feel uncomfortable with that because those autoregressions were actually changing how we were thinking about the growth process itself, and I wanted to separate those. And we do this in the multi-level model all the time. We talked a little bit about this in the last episode. The within-person process is orthogonal to the between. And what that means is, as we build the within process, it doesn't change the characteristics of the underlying growth. You have the trajectories of depression, you have trajectories of anxiety, and you can kind of dink around with all those effects if they're orthogonal, and it won't change those underlying trajectories. I went back to the whiteboard, and I had a memory of a wonderful guy named David Rinskoff. I think you know David.
I do.
David is a remarkable guy.
Great guy.
He's made wonderful contributions to many, many areas. But to my knowledge, he was the first one to propose the phantom variable.
Which is the coolest name for anything in our field, right?
Besides being a Star Wars title, I think, wasn't that one of the 18, the phantom variable?
Is that number one? I'm trying to remember which.
Number one that came out 8th? I don't know.
At last we will have revenge.
He came up with this incredibly clever way of creating what were functionally one-item latent factors that aren't latent factors in the way we usually think about them. And I thought, well, wait a minute. What if I used phantom variables for the time-specific residuals?
You have been well trained, my young apprentice.
So we're going to move into the residual matrix that is representing those within-person effects. What if I make those latent variables? I could then use one residual to predict another residual. So instead of the variable predicting the variable, I'm going to jump it up into the residuals. And being the incredibly artistic, creative, clever guy that I am, I called that the latent curve model with structured residuals.
Wow.
My pet growing up was named Cat.
I have to say, this is probably my favorite of your hairballs of science. I mean, it really is. This is such a clever idea because in the alt model, as you said, the variables are connected. And we know from some of the discussion around the autoregressive cross-lag panel model, we know that that has a difficult time sometimes separating out what are the between processes from what are the within processes. And so what you did is to move everything into the residuals where you brought it to the individual level. It is my level of aggression at time 2 above or below my own trajectory. So it's relative to me, not relative to anybody else. And so, yes, blah, 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 orthogonalization, yada, yada. What you did is a very clean separation of within and between. So if someone thinks that their own alcohol consumption is a little bit high relative to their growth trajectory or a little bit low relative to their growth trajectory, it's that thing that you are relating to their anxiety, whether it's high or low relative to their own growth trajectory. So you succeeded in making this a within aspect of the model, and it's one of my favorite hairballs for sure.
Well, I appreciate it. And when I say that's just an abject lie. It takes a village kind of thing. A lot of it came out of my work with Bolin, who really helped me with the analytics. Mm-hmm. If you've seen our alt paper, it's Bolin and Curran. Ken took the lead on that. And it's actually very technical in the developments, and that was all Ken helping me understand that. And so a lot of this came through Ken's help, but also a ton of collaborators. Andrea Howard worked very closely with me on this, and she had pretty darn near equal contributions. That couldn't have existed without Andrea's help. And then Sierra Boehner, Stephanie Lane, Jim McGinley. That was very much a group effort.
Nice.
But the thing I really like is jumping up into the residuals. Those autoregressions and those lags, they don't impact the growth factors anymore.
Yep.
The means don't change. The variances change a little bit because it's related to the covariance, but it's just maximum likelihood trying to balance weight on the ship, they'll change a little bit. But I'm not kidding with the alt model. Like you would do the unconditional growth and you would write a discussion section about what depression was doing. But in the alt model, if you bring in those in the way I described, you can have a completely different implied growth function in depression when you bring in anxiety. Mm-hmm. It's correct. Mm-hmm. It's up to you as to whether that's what you want or not.
Right.
Because there are situations where you would. Raudenbush has an amazing example with TVCs where he wants to model trajectories of reading ability in children, but he wants to account for the time-specific effects of how many days of instruction a kid missed. Mm-hmm. Because in lower income families, it's much more likely that you're going to miss school. So he wanted to look at growth in reading, having adjusted for that time varying covariate. He wants the means and the variances to change. That was the point. So if that's what you want, the alt model is spot on. And again, Ken has gone on to do some really lovely work of using this as a general framework to get to a whole bunch of different models. All I'm saying is, for the kind of questions I tend to think about, I don't want those to change. I want to treat them as separate. There's a within-person process and there's a between-person process. And through the parameterization of the model, meaning what we draw on the whiteboard, we can orthogonalize those so that they operate separately.
One of the early points that we were trying to make in this episode is that how you wind up connecting these variables is tied to whatever your belief or whatever your question is. So if I said multivariate growth model, what would the shape of a research question be for someone who wanted to run something like that?
What I would say is you are interested in how two constructs travel together through time at the level of the individual. If you are accelerating in your reading ability, do you also accelerate in your math ability? Do those two things travel together through time? But you are fundamentally not interested in, does earlier reading ability predict later math, or does earlier math predict later reading? You are just saying, I'm going to let reading do its thing, I'm going to let math do its thing and see that if kids who are increasing more steeply in one, do they tend to increase more steeply in the other?
I like that answer. So then we move to a hybrid model like the alt model. And you were telling us a little bit about a question. Can you say again then, if someone were choosing the alt model, what would be the shape of the question that they would be asking?
I mean, that one's tougher, which is why I started trying to expand it.
Yeah.
It's more of a aggregation of between and within. And I kind of came to see that as a simultaneous expression of the data where does your earlier reading in part predict your later math in the presence of everything else that's going on?
Yeah.
Using MLM-like language, it's an aggregate effect. You're not cleanly separating the within and the between person.
Yeah. And one of the things you said earlier about path tracing is so beautifully evident in all of these models. If I was asking in a multivariate growth model, how is time 2 alcohol use related to, whether it's time 2 anxiety or time 3 anxiety, I am tracing up through the growth process and how the growth processes are related. And that's where those things are connected. When I get to the alt model and I do my path tracing and I say something like, how is time 2 alcohol use related to time 2 or time 3 anxiety? I might be tracing in part through the growth process. I might be tracing in part through the autoregressive process. So there's things that you have to believe are operating simultaneously. And now I move to the Lickamsur.
Which is what Greg calls the LCMSR.
If someone's calling something Ricklepim, then we're calling this Lickamsur.
But I got to tell you, I think it was a missed opportunity because I am on day 522 of Duolingo and I'm trying to get my Spanish back.
Wow.
Really, it should be Lickum Señor if it's the SR. I mean, if we're going to be accurate about it, actually, I am calling for it right here and right now. It is Ricklepim and Lickum Señor.
Okay. For our international audience. Great. So when we move to the
Go ahead.
Lickum Señor, tell me the shape of that research question for the model.
Well, my theory best corresponds to the Lickum Señor model, which is I believe there to be an underlying continuous developmental process that in part determines alcohol use and in part determines anxiety. There's individual variability in starting point and rate of change in each, and we want to relate those to one another. That's the standard latent curve part of the model. But I also am exceedingly interested in if you're higher in anxiety than you usually are at time 1, do you tend to drink more alcohol use than you usually do at time 2? And what we're doing is picture each person's trajectory with their observed measures humming around it. We're saying that if your dot, your observed measure on anxiety at time 1 is above your trajectory, is that associated with your observed value dot being above your alcohol use trajectory at the following time point? So if you're higher than you usually are on anxiety, do you drink more than you usually do on alcohol? And then we're averaging that over people and we're running it both ways. If you're higher on alcohol use, do you tend to experience more anxiety? And those are the reciprocal effects. And for me, it's very near. It's not all the way, but it's very near to a lot of questions that we really do ask at a theoretical level, whether we even know it or not, is we're not interested in between, we're not interested in within, we're interested in both and how those jointly reproduce the characteristics of the data that we observed in our sample.
Okay, wait. You said you're not all the way there?
And your wife says that you don't listen when other people talk. I am so proud of you. Yeah, because here's what it is. It's not a limitation of the model if what I described is what the question is that you're after. All right, but here's a weird little thing, and I have to fight myself from saying this. We have to be very careful about how we interpret the Lickum Señor effects. I was very clear that it is if you are higher than you usually are at one time point on one construct, are you higher than you usually are on another construct? And I always say higher. These are symmetric. You could be higher and lower, lower and higher, right? Mm-hmm. What we cannot say, and I got to tell you, we really want to sometimes, is that if my anxiety increases between time 1 and time 2, does my alcohol use increase between time 2 and time 3? That is a fundamentally different question that Lickham's Señor has no ability to evaluate.
Yeah, and what you're trying to do is to start to bring T back into the change process, right? Because as it stands right now, if we have this growth trajectory that cuts across all of time, there isn't a sub-T. When you start talking about the change from time 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 and 3 to 4, we sort of are getting our sub-Ts back, but it's now in terms of change. It's not where we are in terms of a level of a particular variable or where we are in terms of a level relative to our own trajectory. Now we're literally breaking the trajectory up into the pieces that happen across each of the time points. And in order to do that, we need to go up to the whiteboard and erase all the stuff that we have on there and now start drawing a different model.
And enter from stage left the latent change score model, which came out of the remarkable depths of Jack McArdle's brain. There were a number of other colleagues. Again, none of us work in a vacuum, as There's Emilio Ferrer and Kevin Grimm and Hamagami, and so there are a lot of people involved. But it really was Jack was the lead of that. And what I love about it is, what is a line? This is so fun because Greg and I are like almost at the peak of our careers. Like we can't go any higher, mostly because of incompetence. We use 8th grade math in most of what we do. What is a line? Well, it's rise over run that is equal between each time point. So change between 1 and 2 is equal to change between 2 and 3 is equal to change between 3 and 4. That is a line.
Right.
So we can have a linear trajectory where we compute the time adjacent change and set them to be equal.
Yeah.
And what Jack said was, well, wait a minute. It's still a whiteboard problem. We're still working with the same rectangles. He's going to draw, and I got to tell you, it's like him and Rinskov renting a van and a keg of beer and like taking a road trip across the country with phantom variables. If you look at a path model for one of these things, I mean, it is like phantom variables gone nuts.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Completely.
I'll refer to something that you would relate to. It's a trouble with Tribbles.
Oh, it is. The Trouble with Tribbles is a classic episode from the original Star Trek series in the 1960s.
There must be thousands of them.
1,771,561.
So the Tribbles, all they did is they reproduce like at a very high rate. And so phantom variables are reproducing at a very high rate. But what the latent change score model does is instead of saying, is your relative standing at one time point predicting of your relative standing at another time point, which is a very important and valid question to ask, is just saying, does your change between 2 time points on one construct relate to your change in the following time points on the other construct? It's a different path diagram, but it's a different theoretical question.
It's a beautiful model, one that we could spend a lot more time talking about, but I love it because it gives us flexibility to look at co-development that we don't otherwise have and more local co-development, right? Because the influence that change in one variable has on change in another might be different earlier in the process than it is later in the process. And we can't get that when we're operating at the level of a multivariate growth model. So I love that we're getting all the way down to that. And also it is possible, as Patrick alluded to constrain this more flexible latent change score model to get some of the more traditional growth models. So that's a point worth making. The other point is you said we're at the peak of our career. Oh, honey, you peaked so long ago.
I didn't didn't say I didn't. I mean, it's
Okay.
asymptote is not bounded. It's infinite, right?
Okay,
So that
just to be clear.
There's some phrase in the military, I don't remember what it is, but there's some phrase about when it's written in somebody's record that they have achieved their ideal rank, means that they shall go no farther. I think you and I have achieved our ideal rank.
Maverick, 30 plus years of service, yet you can't get a promotion, you won't retire, and despite your best efforts, you refuse to die. You should be at least a 2-star admiral by now. Yet here you are, captain. Why is that?
It's one of life's mysteries, sir.
Now, I got two thoughts. One is some of you may be saying, well, wait a minute, right? And when I say some of you, I mean like the country of the Netherlands are saying, why are you not talking about Rickelpim? If you're talking about Lickum Señor, why are you not talking about Rickelpim? Well, Rickelpim is a wonderful, lovely model. We interviewed Ellen Hamacher, a year or two ago about dynamic SEM, and she does amazing work. And she has that incredible paper, I think it was in 2017 in Psych Methods, on the autoregressive cross-lag and then the random intercept autoregressive cross-lag. It shares a lot of similarities with the LCMSR. These were developed independently. She was working with her group, I was working with my group. But why we haven't talked about it in a lot of detail is there is actually a pretty big difference between the two that are not evident in the path diagrams. A lot of people will say, oh, they're the same model. It doesn't matter. They're actually not. Because in the LCM-SR model, we continue to restrict the mean structure in a very strong way. We literally remove the means from the repeated measures, and we force the model to reproduce them solely through the mean of the latent factors. That is the cardinal characteristic of what makes a latent curve model a latent curve model. We are reproducing the variance-covariance structure, but we are also reproducing the mean structure. Because Rickelpim grew out of the autoregressive cross-lag tradition, the mean structure there is actually saturated. So no restrictions are imposed on the means, and you're focused on the variance-covariance structure, but not the mean structure. That's neither good nor bad. It's another statement. It's another way of drawing on the whiteboard. But that might be an interesting future episode of the broader question of, well, what are the means bringing to the party, right? Why are the means so important to the Lickum Señor model, but are saturated in the Rickelpim model?
Lots more to talk about.
Our apologies to the Dutch, but we will come back and talk about that on a later
And
day.
the Swedish and the...
I'm sorry, dude. We don't have enough time to do an alphabetized list of apologies.
And Sharpie and, yeah. All right.
But the other thought is you seriously have a plane to catch.
I do.
This is not a figurative gag. You actually...
I'm taking my 49.5-pound bag. All right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Hey, thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
I think you actually mean Skärgårdsbefolkningsutredningen.
Thanks so much for joining us. Quantitude has been brought to you by additional office products that, pardon me, excuse me, sir. I was holding the mic. Excuse me, Mr. President, please.
I talked to the Quantitude guys, Pat and Craig, great guys. They said, sir, would you reach out to your friends at Sharpie and have them make us a pen? I said, sure, if you have Jiffy on the show more. I was talking to Jiffy a week or two ago. He called me in the Oval Office. He's clearly the real intellect behind the podcast's success. He'd make a great running mate, actually. He suggested a full range of office supplies, which isn't a bad idea. I was envisioning a Quantitude stapler. I actually dated the sister of the founder of Swingline, which is the Cadillac of staplers, in my opinion. We'd have to look into getting gold staples, of course, or how about Quantitude paper clips, like in the shape of a curly Q for Quantitude. I love paper clips. I used to use them as money clips when I was a little kid, until I got my first money clip from my grandfather for my 5th birthday. I'll never forget when he said to me, DJ, he always called me DJ because he was a big fan of Dwayne Johnson and Derek Jeter. DJ, he said, always listen to great podcasts. Your grandmother and I especially love those guys on the Quantitude. So I've been a huge fan since probably the early 60s. What about a Quantitude 3-hole punch? Or Quantitude sticky notes? I can talk to the president of Post-it and see if he can make you guys something extra sticky.
That is enough, sir. Thank you. We're out of time, sir. Thank you.
But only if they're the stickiest.
You can subscribe to Quantitude on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your Hairball of Science podcasts, and please leave us a review. You can also follow us on X, Blue Sky, or Instagram. We are at QuantitudePod. And visit our website at quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find playlists, show notes, class syllabi, and other fun stuff. Finally, get cool Quantitude merch like mugs, stickers, and notebooks from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized sellers go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You have been listening to Quantitude, the podcast you wish could be as easily erased as a whiteboard model.